Listen, I'm gonna let you in on a secret, but you gotta promise not to tell anyone, especially Netflix. Somehow, I've still been able to stream on my family's Netflix account nearly a year past the date they announced to kick everyone off of it, despite the fact that we all live thousands of miles apart, and I haven't been paying for more screens. I figure it's only a matter of time until they realize this, so if I'm basically living on borrowed time, I decided I'd do a video on what made this company such a media giant in the first place. This show saw its 10th year anniversary recently, which was the most crucial moment in time for online television as a whole. This show was Netflix's attempt at challenging the dominance of network TV, delivering the first truly modern television program, through both cinema as serialized drama, and within the very medium itself. But unlike that spider that got sucked up in your Dyson, this show doesn't exist in a vacuum. It was based off a BBC program of the same name, which itself was adapted from the original book, written by a British political insider. While I'm mostly focused on the American show, and Netflix's place in the early 2010s television landscape, I'll give context for this material in general, while also examining whether any of this was actually any good in the first place. Which, yeah, I'll get to that. But for now, I'm focusing on the seasons that serve as direct analog to the British material. But before I get into any of this, I do want to address a giant Kevin Spacey-shaped elephant in the room. I'm not trying to convince you to feel any particular way about this. It's just that it's hard to talk about this series without mentioning him, so I'd just like to get my general take out there on all this. A lot of talent and effort got put into creating this thing that goes well beyond what you see in front of the camera. The pure amount of hours contributed off screen by all these people you never see, none of that changes because one of the stars happens to be, well, Kevin Spacey. Broadly speaking, actors are the face of this industry, but they aren't the soul of it, and they shouldn't be the single determining factor as to whether or not the mass cumulative effort of all these people deserves to even be seen in the first place. And I'll admit I did have some reservations on this. I even tried deepfaking Christopher Plummer over him just to see what it would look like. I've never used this software before, so my first attempt made everyone come out looking like the Foxhound unit from Metal Gear Solid. But when I finally built a decent model, outside of the fact that it doesn't really handle foreheads particularly well, it felt a little too Black Mirror-ish, like I was digitally unpersoning this guy. So that's the main reason I decided to not racy Spacey's facey. I don't think there's an easy way around this. I just want to make it clear I didn't take these considerations lightly, for whatever that's worth. With that out of the way, so it's the early 2010s, and Netflix needs a new victim to satiate its unending bloodlust, at a time where David Fincher was shopping around an idea for an American adaptation of this British property. In terms of why Netflix chose this show as its early foray into producing its own native content, if you're a television platform, and David Fincher approaches you saying he wants to do TV now, the only reasonable answer to that is
yes.
Though a show about a somewhat obscure political figure that nobody ever really thought about, fighting his way through a deeply entrenched system to come out on top against all odds, is something that maybe appealed to these guys on a subconscious level. I don't know, I could just be reading too much into it. I did take some time to study British politics for this video, mostly interviews, archival footage, and memes, obviously. I also learned there's actually kind of an interesting parallel between these two political systems, starting around 1980, and seeing this adaptation reflected onto a shifting but somewhat congruent transatlantic political environment. A scorned Tory in the 1980s, who rose to prominence in Thatcher's cabinet, translated into a Southern Democrat during the Obama years, was actually kind of neat, especially given the full historical and political context. The premise itself is pretty basic. Francis is a senior legislator who's promised a cabinet position if their party wins in the general election. Upon winning, he's still relegated to his former position, and because of this, he resolves to embarrass and destroy the careers of everyone he deemed either responsible, complicit, or just unfortunate enough to be in his way. This is all superimposed onto a Shakespearean character study about ambition and the depravity someone is willing to engage in to get what he wants. And if that all sounds sort of nuts, it's because it was written by a former British cabinet member in the 1980s who manifested all of his accumulated anger and personal resentments into 382 pages of spite, which is how I assume all British people deal with interpersonal grievances. I am glad he handled it in the most dysfunctional way possible, because some of this is actually kind of good. Because if you're able to get past the paperback premise of the story, there's some actual quality drama hidden somewhere beneath the physical embodiment of tea time and Spacey's anachronistic Carolinian accent. Most characters in the BBC version have a direct analog in the US adaptation, and comparing them side by side is actually a pretty good way to highlight the core differences between the two stories. Francis Underwood had permeated modern pulp culture to a point where, in the mid-2010s, even if you hadn't seen the show, you probably got the gist of what he was, which I assume is what the creative team considered to be the American cultural equivalent of this dude. Francis Urquhart is absolutely savage in the most pompously English way possible. He plays a straightforward Shakespearean ambitious archetype that doesn't overstay his welcome, given the runtime the entire first season isn't that much longer than most actual Shakespearean tragedies. Interestingly enough, Underwood actually seems more tame by comparison, at least initially, since they're given enough time to really sell his moral downturn. Conversely, Urquhart is a borderline psychopath right out of the gate, making kind of an interesting contrast to his American counterpart. They're both their respective parties' chief legislative whips, which are elected senior party members that ensure other members of their party vote a certain way, who will apply various incentives and pressures whenever they feel necessary to generate a specific outcome. This was a great writing choice made by Michael Dobbs, and all adaptations are smart enough to carry this detail over. It gives each Francis enough experience and maneuverability to engage with others in a way that very few other people in politics can get away with. If you're making a story about someone knee-deep in the political trenches, I couldn't think of a better starting position. Also, across adaptations, they both utilize a specific response to implicitly confirm a piece of information while maintaining plausible deniability.
You might very well think that. I couldn't possibly comment.
It's also interesting to note that Urquhart is a lot more ideological than Underwood. You can tell Frank really couldn't care less about the Democrats, despite being a senior Democrat legislator, while Francis is an actual right-wing activist within the British Conservative Party, and will rationalize his actions to the audience by claiming his adversaries are not just too soft, but that they're too centrist, which is another interesting contrasting aspect to these two protagonists, especially considering what Frank thought of the progressives in his own party. Macbeth is a specific Shakespearean tragedy it draws parallels to, and these two are one bloody hand-washed monologue away from getting stabbed by a C-section baby. Macbeth works pretty well in this framework, in a modern context that carries most of the themes of the Shakespearean tragedy, while trading witchcraft and prophecy for a sense of cold, mechanical, technological determinism that exists almost as a unique product of modernity. Throughout these early seasons, Francis utilizes a reporter to help undermine his political enemies. This character is probably the most straightforward carryover. They're both quick to latch onto his scheme for their own personal career advancement, even egging him on in a lot of moments in the instances when they feel he's being too careful or passive. Most characters Francis contends with just exist to be used by him, but these two sometimes end up being the primary motivators at specific points. There's some alterations in the newspaper. Manny's paper has a pretty explicit conservative lean that's influential enough to be respected by both party elites and his constituents, while Zoe's outlet seems a lot more closer to a diminishing old media with smaller readership. And while that outlet's owner has a pretty minor role in the US adaptation, in the BBC version, American Rupert Murdoch gets plenty of screen time. Also in the BBC version, the reporter is famous for teaching the poor, innocent, unsuspecting, geriatric British broadcast viewer what an electrocomplex is. While this relationship comes off as kind of goofy, outside of that, these two might have otherwise been my favorite characters if it wasn't for this next guy. In the BBC version, Tim Stamper is pretty much just a stock character who exists solely as a narrative utility, but Doug Stamper is by far the most underrated addition to the US series, and it's not even close. Much like Manny Storin in the previous series, Doug Stamper is this show's designated Freudian menace. It's hard to write evil people in political thrillers without them coming off as stupid or cartoonish, but everything about this particular character feels so authentic in his depravity and his mechanical, weaponized, obsessive personality to a point where it actually elevates the original material in a super meaningful way. This guy's great in how absolutely pathological he gets later in these first 26 episodes while still coming off like a real person. He's a genuine villain to so many supporting characters, all of whom are decent people for the most part, to a point where he'd absolutely be the antagonist if he didn't happen to be working for the protagonist. He's the Emperor's perfect Darth Vader. If I ever go back to this material with all that leftover footage I have, it'll be to make a video about this guy. He really is that good. Francis exploits another political figure for leverage. He then ends up unaliving after losing control of him. And hold on, be real with me. If I told you that Peter Russo's character in the British version was Irish, would that really surprise you? An impulsive drug-addicted party animal who drinks too much, who's well-meaning, but easily manipulated, with pervasive self-destructive tendencies, and is generally incapable of thinking things through. If you want to know what Great Britain thinks about this island right here, it's all perfectly embodied by this dude. While Roger O'Neill is basically a coke-addicted leprechaun, Peter Russo feels a lot more real and tragic in the US version. While it still requires some suspension of disbelief in a few moments, his character does feel authentic for the most part. Nobody really talks about these supporting characters, including these two, despite ostensibly being the unwitting primary antagonist for these series, for a few reasons. Francis absolutely blindsides these guys so fast that this guy is literally out of office by the beginning of episode 3, but somehow this idiot manages to hold out for nearly 2 entire seasons. In the US version, these people usually just serve as a villain of the week that only exists to get dunked on by Frank, after which they often just disappear forever. While this chicanery just lasts over 2 hours in the original, it's a 26-hour ordeal in the Netflix version, where I guess nobody talks to each other to warn people about Frank methodically obliterating everything that everyone has ever worked for. If you people haven't caught on to this by episode 20, you'll deserve this by that point. There's a general creative disinterest in these supporting characters that can really only be interpreted as a missed opportunity. In the BBC version, Mrs. Urquhart doesn't really do much outside being an enabler in Francis's revenge quest. Seriously, these two literally bully this geriatric Englishman into becoming the head of state, and it's hilarious. In the American version, her character receives a lot more screen time and development. They both embrace this kind of caustic, all-consuming ambition, but they're different enough to act as foils to each other in interesting ways. The problem is that while Claire is a reasonably competently constructed character on paper, she doesn't really get the focus she needs to stand out on her own, which leads to an underdeveloped arc in her first season, stagnation in the middle seasons, and what I can only describe as complete character assassination by the final season. But in season 2, she's given more focused character arcs that amount in meaningful payoffs, and overall the show is definitely better for having her, though it's a shame this is literally the only season she's given enough quality material to work with. I'll give a quick recap of both series, starting with Francis Urquhart's July jaunt through Parliament. So Francis gets snubbed for his promised position, and in retaliation, he immediately begins consolidating power and spamming the PM with a bizarre series of scandals, one of which literally involves Francis putting on a mustache and pretending to be the PM's brother to make a fraudulent insider trading investment. Listen, okay, in their defense, the BBC budget back then was like the spare change they found in the cushions at Buckingham Palace. It's 1990s public television. They really were doing their best. You should see what their sci-fi looked like. And I'm not gonna lie, going between the visual slickness of the American version and the comparative simplicity of the original actually made me appreciate what would otherwise only be interpreted as camp by modern television production standards. Every compounding scandal and public embarrassment gets immediately exacerbated due to the fact that, apparently, and I didn't know this was a thing before researching it, all of Parliament literally gets to roast a head of state once a week. For real, they didn't make this up. This is an actual thing that the UK government engages in on a literally weekly basis. If all this has convinced me of anything, it's that British people really are just built different.
To be discussed under Standing Order number 24. Has the Right Honourable and Learned Member the leave of the House? No!
This continues until all of Francis's actions start catching up with him, and it causes a designated ethnic caricature to become a liability. Compared to Underwood's last-minute bargaining with Peter to not go public with incriminating info and desperately exploring every possible alternative avenue, Urquhart invites him over and literally just sits there, maliciously eyeing Roger in near total silence for like 20 minutes, only breaking that silence to literally drop actual Macbeth quotes, until Roger was drunk enough so he can spike his cocaine.
She loved me, that girl, Francis. And I loved her.
I'll kill him. I'll kill him dead. This guy's toast.
This guy's constant willingness to go from 0 to 100 is absolutely nuts. Later on, he straight just casually starts sending political adversaries their own secretly recorded sex tapes at one point. And some of this goes in directions that would frankly only exist in early 90s British television. Like, I'm sorry, this is hilarious. I don't know what you want me to say. I will say this original series in general had like zero chill.
The man's a lout, of course. A lout, a lecher, an anti-Semite, a racist, and a bully.
This book was actually meant to be a one-off for Michael Dobbs, and it originally ended with Francis getting exposed before jumping off the roof of Parliament. The BBC decided to pick it up as serialized television and asked for more books, so he retconned the original ending, and Francis pushes the reporter off of Parliament instead. Unfortunately, the BBC version ends up being kind of like, well, this. It also makes the age-old mistake of saying the quiet part out loud. While in the US version, Zoe is tastefully nudged in front of a DC metro carriage, like how all clandestine political slayings should occur. The BBC version ends with Francis staring into the camera and rationalizing his crimes to you, the audience, before pausing and waiting for your internal moral condemnation, and responding in the exact way you'd expect.
You might very well think that. I could not possibly comment.
The next BBC season deals with words my stupid American brain doesn't understand, like constitutional monarchy and royal line of succession, so that's where I intentionally limited the scope of this material. Overall, this thing actually still holds up after 30 years, if you can get past the budget restrictions and the unrelenting Britishness of it all. Next, let's take a closer look at Frank Underwood's journey to the center of the frame. Compared to the British theme, the American version sounds like a death march towards oblivion, which, I mean, that's what the show is. When combined with the sped up city movements and the setting sun, this intro gives the impression of impending accelerated doom, ending with a universal military distress signal placed right in front of the nation's central seat of power, showing that the country as a whole is in peril. This is 60 seconds of raw anxiety compared to something that feels like it's a prelude to a lighthearted Attenborough documentary about the Anglo-Saxon and his natural habitat. Despite sharing the same basic premise as a BBC version, a lot of these characters get fleshed out substantially to fill this runtime. Instead of a straightforward British gentlemanly archetype, you get this self-aggrandizing narcissist who spends way too much time with avant-garde video games, a slow-running internal monologue directed at nobody in particular, shadowed by a habitual desire for constant approval. I am in this picture and I do not like it. Despite both following the same broad narrative, the American version, like most US-made mature television dramas created after 2007, utilizes a Soprano-styled episodic character study, which seems to be where most of the creative interest from this team lied. It's clearly studied a lot of Beltway mannerisms and political structures, but most of the high-quality content is found in these little field trips. These little non-sequitur side quests do a lot to distract you from how most of the episodes start off with just these weird little schemes floated out by Frank that somehow always end up working with minimal effort on his end. And he's basically never challenged at any point in this process because this administration is so bad at fleshing out leakers that it makes the previous administration's InfoSec look like Area 51 in comparison. While Season 1 is probably the best given its ability to consistently deliver the aforementioned concentrated character studies, Season 2 escalates everything in interesting and meaningful ways. And it almost distracts you from the fact that the later half of the main narrative is a convoluted mess. I thought I had a pretty decent understanding of what happened when I rewatched it, but going back and actually trying to trace this out, for the life of me, I can't find anything that provides any sort of coherent summary of what went down. Outside the fact that Frank did some dumb stuff and then punted off on Garrett, who, if I haven't sufficiently established by this point, is an idiot. And all of this only ends because Garrett's primary donor gets so fed up with his incompetence that he literally chooses to incriminate himself in front of the entire House Judiciary Committee just to throw Garrett under the bus, and honestly, I couldn't blame him by that point. I mentioned the differing cultural context earlier, but there's also a pretty notable political difference between these two. Like, I'm not exactly a political commentator, but politics are pretty unavoidable in a show about politics. That is, unless you're the US adaptation of House of Cards. This show really is the anti-West Wing. One of these shows is a hopeless romantic when it comes to early 21st century American liberal Democrat politics. The other is the establishmentarian's Shadow the Hedgehog. For real, the majority of characters just don't care about anything. And I'm not even saying they need to necessarily, but the lack of basic personal political framework for someone as senior as a congressional chief whip is kind of nuts. And this apathy and shallow opportunism seeps into the core plotlines as well. While Frank's wife is fighting for a women's protection bill, based off of her and other women's own genuine personal experiences of abuse, his assistant is, at Frank's own behest, literally trafficking this woman, controlling every facet of her life, and hiding her in a remote area to intentionally isolate her from anyone who can help her. Also, it's worth noting that Doug Stamper, who at the time was the chief of staff for the current Liberal VP, that has a personal disdain for the NRA, chooses to place Rachel in a pro-Second Amendment Political Action Committee call center, presumably because it just happened to be more logistically convenient for him. And of course he couldn't actually care about the actual politics of it all, which, hang on, I'm definitely pro-Second Amendment, but if someone cold called me with this script, I'd reflexively smash that end call button. Like I mentioned, this political thriller is paradoxically at its best when it isn't concerning itself with a power consolidation throughline. These little moments with characters that aren't major political figures are where the overwhelming majority of the quality content lies. That plus an aesthetic set by what might be the best modern film director, music by an Emmy award-winning composer, and a high-quality cast and production crew, being created at a time where the stakes for the future of online streaming couldn't be higher, meant that this was always going to upstage the original material. But in the end, they were both everything they needed to be at the time they came out, and honestly, that's pretty commendable. Also, okay, Margaret Thatcher. I don't know where else to put this, so I'll stick it here. I mentioned that this was basically some British politician's unsent hate mail. Lord Michael Dobbs, the author of the original book, was actually Thatcher's chief of staff from 1986 to 87. A week before the general election of 87, she had popped off on Michael during a cabinet meeting, blaming him for what appeared to be an impending significant loss for the Conservatives. After leaving office that year, while on vacation, he wrote a book about a character with the initials FU, reflecting his opinions on his former boss, which later get fleshed out to Francis Urquhart. He mentioned that the book itself was a joke, that he hadn't actually really intended to publish initially, but went for it anyway. So this entire series was literally the product of one dude's shitpost responding to an actual personal attack from Maggie frickin' Thatcher, where he makes a character literally named FU and undermines the entire Conservative Party over a personal slight. And I don't know why, but that's just super interesting. Also, while I'm here, I do think it's worth giving a lot of credit to the original author. Even on a general personal level, he actually seems like a really decent and respectable person, and I definitely admire anyone who somehow managed to survive both the IRA and Margaret Thatcher. This show was as big of a deal as early 90s BBC original content got, but it didn't get widespread overseas recognition until Netflix got involved. And for the Americans, there's a lot more on the line. This show was made before the modern streaming giant has endless catalog of high budget yet completely disposable original content. It was made with something to prove. This thing was a big deal, and there was a lot riding on its success. A tech company had to prove it could be a real competitor to cable, and a high-profile failure could have changed the modern streaming landscape. And honestly, it actually pulled it off. This show got Netflix the respect it needed to be considered anything but a niche web thing. I remember this happening. This was actually exciting. People paid attention after this. This show proved there's only one way out for the future of network television. While it took more original programming to cement this new streaming-oriented landscape, initially almost single-handedly creating such a fundamental paradigm shift out of the gate was super impressive for just a single show. But that acclaim didn't last forever. I guess this is a good time as any to talk about what came after these first couple of years for the American show. And I understand the fanbase is pretty divided on the post-season 2 quality, but for whatever my personal take is worth, it's absolutely mind-blowing how quickly this show falls apart. Like a house of cards. They're aimless, unengaging, and entirely soulless. They jettison everything that made this show work in the first place. An important distinction to make is that this didn't begin with Season 6. It began with the very first episode of Season 3, starting with Frank. A lot of things went wrong, and there's a myriad of reasons why this show became a shambling corpse of empty characters and half-delivered ideas, but in terms of what immediately stands out at the surface level, one decent metric for measuring how much a show has fallen off is how quickly characters are flanderized. And for Frank, it was literally the moment Season 3 began. This subtle, conniving, brilliant political actor who specializes in optics, who is great at keeping his many personal contempts private until he found the perfect vector of attack, is now, in the very first scene of Season 3, literally publicly urinating on his own father's tombstone in a cemetery in broad daylight, and a few episodes later he's spitting on crucifixes in a major DC church. Meanwhile, his recently relapsed assistant is now having prostitutes shoot whiskey into his mouth from a syringe. There's a subplot where members of a real-life Russian opposition punk rock band are invited as guests at a dinner with fictional Vladimir Putin for some reason, and it goes exactly as well as you would expect.
I knew Pussy Riot was a bad idea.
Oh wow, you think? They get so lazy and stupid that it gets to a point where Frank starts trying to take out political adversaries by just casually pushing them down a shallow flight of stairs. In these 3 seasons, the returning characters who aren't completely flanderized end up stagnating, and all the new characters end up being either completely unremarkable or just miserable to watch. But beyond the incredibly poor characterization, the show itself also ends up stagnating with nowhere else to go now. The reason I'm hyper-fixating on all this absurdity is because there's nothing else here worth caring about. While the first season was a slow yet inevitable build-up to Frank becoming a killer, and the second was a desperate struggle for survival while attempting to enact his final act of revenge, from 3 onward, they're stuck with a full-on psychopath with nothing else to do other than spin their wheels, while making wild and desperate attempts at maintaining your attention in the meantime. The earlier seasons had some goofy stuff in them, sure, but I didn't feel the need to bring them up because 1, they don't overwhelm the good content, and 2, I promised myself I wouldn't say the word threechum more than once in this video. And speaking of the wild things that their security detail is forced to witness, with their explicitly mentioned mandatory 24-hour surveillance. Look, I'm not upset that Frank was the third wheel of a live-in polyamorous throuple. I'm upset that Frank was the third wheel of a live-in polyamorous throuple with a character as lame as Tom Yates. This was by far the worst character that was introduced in this entire series, including that last season. I feel like I'm the only one who hates this guy, and if you removed him, you'd still have a series teeming with issues, but I swear this dude had a talent for taking scenes that were merely unremarkable and making them an absolute chore to sit through. Feels like a total self self-insert, so much so that if you do choose to tackle these later seasons, you should really treat these last 4 like they're this guy's political fanfiction. The one interesting aspect about these later seasons is the basic premise that Frank isn't actually all that good of a leader, and I'm generous enough to assume that this was intentional on behalf of the writers. Envisioning this guy as a dog who caught the car, the brutal realization that this level of governance was never where his strength was, is actually kind of an interesting angle to continue this from. That plus him being tied down by the checks and balances of the federal government makes an actually interesting premise of a violent, brutal tyrant trapped in the confines of a Western democracy who ends up not being all that great at his job in the first place. The main structural issue is that they stretch out this premise for 39 hours, and once that's over, you're initially interested by the fact that the show is forced to refocus with the Claire season, before realizing that no, this is still the same writing staff. With this setup, you could theoretically distill all the decent ideas of the later 52 episodes into maybe one final solid season if you slap a Shakespearean ending on it. But looking at what we actually got, the only aspect of Shakespearean tragedy with these later seasons is their similarity to my favorite line from Macbeth. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. But do you want to know what the real tragedy is? It's that even if these writers did know how to keep this thing going, the show itself runs into a more fundamental issue through no fault of its own. This series doesn't know how to exist post-2015, and every attempt at grabbing your attention from the actual real-life headlines that were occurring at the time just came off as increasingly more desperate, and affected the later primary series antagonists as well. There is no interesting, compelling traditionalist Republican candidate to oppose Frank Underwood while this is happening.
You've called women you don't like fat pigs, dogs, slobs, and disgusting animals. Your Twitter account...
Only Rosie O'Donnell.
Real-life Republican voters were proving at the time that they hate this guy. While this show served as a mature, grounded analysis of complex political systems, a real-life cartoon character came in and somehow managed to magically circumvent those very same systems. And if this show ended after the first 2 seasons, it would never, under any circumstance, be forced to be compared with any aspect of the 2016 election. Even if they handle things well with these seasons, this show's ultimate fate was that this nuanced, grounded political thriller was always destined to get lost in the noise of everything that went down that decade. And yeah, I'll mention season 6. A big controversial take is that it's definitely the worst, but not by that much. The thing is, Frank's basic existence was enough to satiate a lot of casual watchers who think as long as they're watching a show about a conniving Kevin Spacey, that they're still getting what they paid for, and a lot of them didn't start paying attention to what they were watching until there was a major change in scenery. Well, that's definitely not fair to Robin Wright, who still gives it a solid go these last 8 episodes. Her script really didn't do her any favors. Given the fact that her performance was strong throughout the entirety of the show, she really shouldn't be on the hook for a lot of more atrocious material. Speaking of, there's one episode here that really destroyed any chance of good faith engagement with this season. I don't really want to waste that much time on it, but it's the main reason I generally don't object to all the visceral hate this final season gets. I totally mean it when I say this was probably the most childishly mean-spirited, brain-dead analyses of gender politics that just somehow ended up being one of the most disgustingly misogynistic things I've ever seen. And I grew up on Xbox Live. I don't think I can articulate just how vile this episode came off as. I absolutely mean it when I say this is probably one of the most spiritually ugly pieces of content on this entire platform. That particular episode is really one of the most callous and misguided things I've ever seen, out of material that actually once knew how to handle structural misogyny in a mature manner. Let's just skip to the end. Alright, you gotta end this nightmare somehow. So they give her a final boss to stab with a knife and call it a day. Who's Claire Underwood's grand arch nemesis? Why, Doug Stamper, obviously. Yeah, Doug, okay, he should have stayed dead when he got his head bashed in by Rachel in season 2. But short of that, he probably shouldn't exist in a post-Frank context, because every excuse for him to still be around feels so incredibly flimsy, and he and Claire had zero meaningful, interesting narrative connection. And I get why they did it, to try to have as many core returning characters as possible, to convince you that this ship that's been taking on water for the last 3 seasons is still seaworthy. But Doug and Claire have so little in common to base any continuing narrative around, that everything between these two feels so contrived, even by season 6 standards. During the boss battle, 9-month pregnant Claire downs some whiskey, then hands a glass to a recovering alcoholic for maximum edginess. NANI? Doug responds by confessing to having killed Frank for some reason, then violently accuses her of widow walking, to a point where he threatens to shank her if she doesn't admit to living in her husband's shadow. But then she Uno reverses him and murks him in the middle of the executive office. And if you're left with more questions than answers, in the writing staff's defense, they probably didn't think he'd still be around by this point. This was obviously a cheap metacontextual way to preempt the criticism that this show is living in Frank Underwood's shadow. So that if you try to argue that, they could literally be like, this is you right now, this is how dumb you look. And as childish as that all is, you know what? They're not wrong. this show doesn't suffer in Frank Underwood's shadow, it suffers in its own shadow. Losing the main character just removed any sort of cover this show still had, and proved what a farce this entire series had devolved into. And it's a shame that this is what it took to get people to realize that they were watching the crudely puppeteered corpse of a show that died 4 years ago. But by this point, the modern television landscape had already fully developed. There were far better alternatives to this garbage elsewhere, both on Netflix and through other services. The new online playing field was leveled by this point, and honestly, very few people are going to bother choosing this over the infinitely better alternatives of the late 2010s. Because of the original breakout success of this show and its streaming platform, television is now willing to be riskier, demand higher budgets, attract more world-class talent, employ cinema-grade production standards, and trust the audience to be able to follow more complex serialized plotlines now that you can watch every episode on your own time. This show spawned all the high-quality content that quickly overtook it. We've been living under these high expectations for so long that it's hard to remember the way things were even just a few decades ago.
Honey, you knew that we were going to have dinner with the Mercers. Why didn't you just tell them the truth?
You can't tell people the truth. They think you're lying. You have to lie to make them think you're telling the truth.
For basically all of television history, in general, TV of any kind, even the most highly respected material of the era, was flatly shot on cheap film, often using a multicam setup and a 4:3 aspect ratio, and distributed in a low-resolution interlaced broadcast signal. And even in the decade prior to this show, the first 10 years of the second golden age of television, high-definition widescreen broadcasts were still relatively new. This show, filmed by what might be the best modern director, with studio-grade digital cameras, and a budget oriented towards replicating cinematic qualities, was relatively novel at the time, and it's pretty much solely responsible for setting the standards that make television look as good as it does now. In terms of visuals, there's a definitive pre-Fincher and post-Fincher era. The Wire and The Sopranos are two of the most highly acclaimed shows ever made, and yet lighting and shot placement and general cinematography are generally thought of from a purely utilitarian perspective. But now, even the most unremarkable piece of television nowadays still has the expectation to look beautiful. This divide is so stark to a point where it's weird seeing something that's visually post-Fincher still using early generation iPhone bubbles in an almost anachronistic sort of way. That plus a viral auto-tune gaffes, the war on terror motif that died down significantly in the later portion of the decade, their quaint impression of an ostensively Limbaugh-type conservative internet commentator, not knowing just how rapidly the political landscape would change in the later half of the decade. Again, none of this is a show's fault, but they're all aging factors. This show was simultaneously deeply revolutionary while still firmly being a product of its time. It's like seeing those old-timey images of alleged time travelers. The prospect of a show paving the way for the future, before itself becoming an immediate part of history, is something that I personally found super interesting looking back on it, and it's this aesthetic that carried the platform to a point where even now, it's still largely seen as a premier streaming service, and it's taken steps beyond the massive investment in original content to try to offer something beyond what's available elsewhere, in the form of games and interactive media. Also, as of now, Netflix is the only large streaming service that caters to my degenerate habit of exclusively consuming content at higher speeds. Because apparently, if you say you want to watch prestige, critically acclaimed, high-budget television dramas at 1.5 speed, people will act like you just peed in the sink.
So, would you have you ever watched anime or shows at 1.5 speed or 2 times speed?
Absolutely not. See, that's good.
Okay, good.
Do any of you do that?
No, we're not psychopaths.
Yeah, do people do that?
I've done that.
For what?
For what show? Huh? There are some shows where you're just I kind of I know what kind of show this is going to be. And so instead of watching it at normal speed, I'm just to make sure, I'm going to watch this show at 1.5 or 2 speed. You have no idea how quickly I can read subtitles now because of this, right?
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that you shouldn't watch videos in the 1.5 speed.
I can't. I physically can't.
You can. You're just not trying hard enough.
I'm just surprised you can consume it at 2 times speed.
Why?
Because it's
so many reasons.
Looking at where we are now, with Netflix's once near monopoly degraded into a deeply entrenched streaming landscape, it's important to acknowledge that this outcome was probably inevitable, especially because the licensing for a catalog this good was frankly unsustainable. But it's worth acknowledging that there was a period in the early 2010s where even the hardcore pirates are paying for subscriptions, and it's important to note that this is what got people paying attention. This was a symbol of the pure optimism that defined the early streaming landscape before the the networks pulled their content, before they overfinanced endless content bloat, before the need to restrict family plans to IP addresses, before they charged twice as much to finance originals that nobody engages with, before the intense production cutting they've been forced to undertake, before the writers and actors strike that didn't exactly end in their favor, or the fact that AI wasn't quite there yet to scab for either position. To be clear, I do think they have the scale, momentum, and general market fundamentals to turn this around. Unless they go back on their password sharing decision, I personally don't plan on sticking around for whatever's next for this company, but I do wish them luck. To be honest, I don't want this video to end on a downer. I'd rather draw attention to what a cool time in history this all was. For the most part, streaming has been overall good, both for a basic convenience and to give a reasonable alternative to the bloated cable packages that become standard around that time. These people are the first to get the technology right, and there's definitely something to be said for that. I still have fond memories of watch parties with my friends and family. That can only happen due to being able to determine when we consume media. This was kind of a proxy for all those feelings, of the early optimism of this technology, of all those nights spent in college in the early 2010s, with half our hall gathered around, not realizing that we were watching history. I kind of wanted to somehow recapture that moment of time within a video. This all meant something to me, and chances are, if you've enjoyed television at all this past decade, it meant something to you too. Thanks for watching.